Many of you know Jonathan from one of his previous incarnations. Some met him as an MPA student here in the 1950s. Some as a fellow at the Institute of Politics in the 1960s. Some as director of the Institute of Politics in the 70s and 80s. Others will remember Jonathan better from the real world. His distinguished government career serving presidents from John Kennedy to Ronald Reagan. Jonathan began public service as an aide to the U.S. Information Agency in India and Liberia. He then became legislative assistant to Massachusetts Senator Leverett Saltonstall. In the Johnson administration, he served as special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. During the Nixon administration, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Counselor to the Department of HEW, Special Assistant to Jonathan resigned with his boss, former chairman of this school's visiting committee, Elliot Richardson, in Watergate's Saturday Night Massacre. He then returned to the school as our first full-time director of the Institute of Politics and as a lecturer in public policy here in the faculty. People who come in the middle of a play only gradually become aware of the plot, the sub-themes, and the meaning of the events that they observe. Each of us sits as audience in many unfolding dramas. Some of us indeed have bit parts in some of them. But most of the time, most of us simply take for granted the structure of these events, the other actors, the props, even the fact that there's a stage. A master craftsman of what is today the Institute of Politics and much of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government is our speaker tonight. As director of the Institute, Jonathan inherited a pilot program for newly elected members of Congress, which enrolled 4 members of Congress. That program grew under his stewardship to our seminar last December, in which 80% of the newly elected members of the House of Representatives participated. Jonathan instituted a quadrennial conference of presidential campaign decision makers, campaign managers, pollsters, the press, that has become the regular, ongoing conversation among the pros, Democrats and Republicans, about the business of electing our chief executive. This forum itself, Harvard's magnet for leaders from government and the policymaking community, emerged from the mind of Jonathan, Nick Metropolis, Ira Jackson, and others here. Before 1978, no such program existed at the Kennedy School. Indeed, there was no such stage as this space. The Institute of Politics, under its founding director Dick Neustadt, then Ernest May, and most recently Jonathan, remains one of the most vital ventures in the school, sustaining real links between the school and the world of elective politics. And what about the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center for Press Politics and Public Policy? Anyone who attended the Kennedy School in 1980 would have found no courses on the press and politics, no research on the topic of the press and politics, no fellows or programs in that activity. Why? Because no such cluster of competence had been created. Among my own personal most satisfying moments in working with Jonathan was our collaboration in bringing that center into being. And a decade hence, when Marvin Kalb, or Nelson Polsby, or Gary Oren, or Marty Linsky, and others have built a body of knowledge about the press and politics that doesn't exist today, and offered instruction on that subject for students here in the school and elsewhere in the university, we will have Jonathan to thank. Last May, Harvard's loss was the nation's gain when President Reagan appointed Jonathan Ambassador at Large for Refugee Affairs. The task before him is overwhelming. There are now more than 10 million refugees around the world, an increase of some 4 million people in the last 6 years. But as what I think of as a very model of the modern public servant this school seeks to train, Jonathan finds the near impossible nearly irresistible. Tonight, Jonathan will address his topic of his current challenge: refugees and foreign policy, immediate assistance, and durable solutions. Please join me in warmly welcoming back our colleague and good friend, Jonathan Moore.
Thank you, Graham. It's very lovely. I appreciate it. And Katie and I are glad to be back, and particularly grateful to all of you nice people for coming tonight. And I want to thank especially Mary McTighe, who was the acting director of the Institute of Politics, and the Institute staff for all the attention that they've given to me, not only today, but over the years. I have an irritation and a dilemma which have distracted me into this speech, so to speak. For a long time, it has bothered me to hear people talking about how important it is to keep their favorite cause out of politics. Currently, as in, we can't let humanitarian assistance to refugees be dominated by foreign policy interests. And both in my political experience before coming to the Institute and the Kennedy School, and in my reflection while here, I have come to be extremely wary of single-issue special interest groups. But what do I do now that I'm involved with one? Even though I know what is meant about politics corrupting goodness and the value of concentrated advocacy, I have tended to view politics as a necessary way of getting from here to there, and to be more comfortable approaching public policy as the reconciliation of a variety of contending needs. I've been trying to work out in my own mind what refugee policy should be, if there is such a thing, and more particularly what role it plays within larger international contexts, what the relationship is reciprocally between refugees and foreign policy. But before laying out even some elementary propositions, in order to have an idea what we're talking about, let's first explore the anatomy, the topography of refugee phenomena in the world. In doing this, we can start to test two principles which I have in mind at the outset. First, that the commitments we engage and the insights we gain from attending to some of the urgent needs of refugees and from enriching our society by bringing some of them here can help enlighten our foreign policy as a whole. Second, that there can be found more affinity and mutual reinforcement than conflict or contradiction among the various components constituting a comprehensive U.S. approach to the world's challenges. So I will take a quick yet exhausting global tour of refugee problems, causes, characteristics, programs, and trends, then consider the efforts undertaken to address the immediate needs of refugees in place and the three so-called durable solutions to deal with refugee populations over the longer run, and finally, examine what needs to be done to get at the root causes which generate and perpetuate refugees, where the refugee-foreign policy relationship is fully revealed and challenged. Currently, as Graham has said, there are over 10 million refugees across the globe and millions more who are displaced or at risk in refugee-like circumstances. In Africa, Malawi is host to some 150,000 Mozambican refugees, with expectations there will be over 200,000 by the year's end. All of the countries surrounding Mozambique are impacted, as are those countries which abut Angola. In Ethiopia, Repressive government policies of forced resettlement and tribal persecution have forced 450,000 refugees into neighboring Somalia. Sudan is host to some 650,000 refugees from Ethiopia, Uganda, and Chad. In Africa especially, refugee movements driven by insurgency wars have also been exacerbated by drought, famine, and economic frailty. The biggest single generator of refugees has been the invasion by the Soviet Union of Afghanistan. Almost one-third of that country's pre-1979 population has sought asylum. Some 2.8 million of its citizens in Pakistan and almost 2 million in Iran, almost twice the number of all the refugees in Africa. In Southeast Asia, the turmoil following the Vietnam War has sent 1.3 million refugees out of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The flow of boat people leaving Vietnam continues today, averaging some 20,000 people annually, and smaller numbers of refugees continue to leave Cambodia and Laos. Thailand is the most heavily impacted country in the region, with some 130,000 refugees in first asylum and a population of some 250,000 Cambodian displaced persons located in camps near the Thai-Cambodian border, fleeing from and warring against an occupying power. The longest existing refugee situation in the world, of course, is that of the Palestinians in the Middle East, where since 1948, approximately 2 million refugees reside in Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Syria, caught stateless, fleeing and fomenting violence, some seething, some captives in their own land. Refugees from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, including Jewish emigres, continue to seek asylum and are received through well-established procedures in both Western Europe and in the other major resettlement countries. Since 1975, 185,000 of these people have sought a new life here in the United States. The flow continues, held in check by restrictive immigration policies of the communist bloc countries. As new fluxes to Europe from Africa and the Near East seek asylum, from Iran, Iraq, Ethiopia, and North Africa, the question of how to process their requests and what to do with those rejected from asylum status is becoming, right now, increasingly difficult and politically disruptive. In Central America, the total number of acknowledged refugees in first asylum within the region is 230,000, fleeing persecution and war, economic and social dislocation, intricately involved in insurgencies in various ways. It has been said that refugees are human rights violations made visible. They live in dislocated, deprived, marginal, ambiguous circumstances with a bleak future. Most remain victims of violence in the countries they have fled and the wars they sometimes bring with them from hostile local populations and their own incipient factionalism. They usually go to countries which are extremely impoverished themselves. The average per capita GNP for nations of first asylum is $822. An ambitious international system of multilateral and bilateral programs utilizing a huge, far-flung array of collaborators administers crucial assistance to refugees. These services including life-sustaining support, food, medical supplies and health aid, education, protection and security, development and impact assistance, representation and negotiation to improve immediate and future treatment of refugees, and resettlement. The partners in the effort include multilateral agencies led by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, international organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, a multitude of non-profit, non-governmental voluntary agencies with enormous commitment and skill, and nation states who receive refugees in first asylum, donate money, resettle refugees, and even in some instances facilitate their return. The United States has sustained its leadership in providing humanitarian assistance across the globe through a traditional bipartisan commitment as a major donor and resettlement state, having welcomed well over 1 million refugees since 1975. This international enterprise has saved and continues to save millions of lives and supports the continued provision of first asylum. It is heroic, absolutely essential, and inadequate. Trends in refugee affairs include a tightening up of formerly open and generous policies by many first asylum countries, increasing pressure on states hosting large number of refugees for scarce resources and services, a tailing off of admissions and funding by resettlement and donor countries, including the United States, a proportional increase of economic migrants and illegal immigrants aided by better communications and transportation technology as distinct from victims of persecution per se, a downward yet continuing flow of refugees from Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Ethiopia, a shift of emphasis from reliance upon resettlement to pressing for repatriation of refugees, increased arrivals of third world asylum seekers into Western Europe and North America, and a continuation of population increases outstripping development. The international refugee effort concentrates itself not exclusively but primarily on immediate assistance to refugees in place, in first asylum, where the need for help comes first and is the most acute. The capacity to provide this help effectively has improved in recent years and can be the difference between life and death, although in some instances access to the suffering populations cannot be achieved, and in others the help provided is very meager. What are the barriers and the limits to such assistance? What are the pressures and dangers of refugee life in camps and settlements? And how permanent are these temporary sanctuaries? Most refugees want above all to return to their homes, yet conditions of safety and stability enabling them to do so remain elusive. The behavior of the receiving country is the most significant variable. The response of the international community, advanced by the UNHCR, is next, but usually it is available and reliable. Receiving countries have security, political, economic, and cultural interests and values which together will determine what their response will be. Often it is most generous and patient. Naturally, internal political stability, conflicts with neighboring states, the relationship of the given refugee population to insurgency ambitions or apprehensions, old ethnic rivalries, contrasts in standard of living, and consideration of foreign alliances and foreign assistance will play a role in determining the refugee policies of the host nation. The whole experience of refugees is an intense mixture of dedication and exploitation, and this is where it begins. Perceptions of first asylum are sometimes determined by distance. What looks like a politically persecuted refugee from far away may appear more like an illegal immigrant up close. Or as a hard-boiled American politician of local renown once put it, it's easier to be liberal further away from home. The negative economic and political impact on local goods, services, and populations, despite substantial imports of outside assistance, the burden on the host country of large refugee influxes staying for long periods is intensive, divisive, destabilizing, dangerous. Consider the effect of having well over 2 million needy Afghans settled temporarily in Pakistan for over 6 years, where even before their arrival the per capita GNP was less than $400. To try to soften the impact of massive refugee influxes, the U.S. and the international community have developed a variety of programs aimed at encouraging self-sufficiency among refugee populations and providing assistance to local populations disrupted by the refugees' arrival. These programs range from reforestation, irrigation, and road building projects with the World Bank in Pakistan to water projects and direct food supplements to affected villages in Thailand. In El Salvador and Uganda, U.S. aid programs help repatriated refugees and returned displaced persons in resettlement and agricultural self-sufficiency projects. In Beirut, the UN Relief and Works Agency offers food and medical supplies to needy communities nearby as a way of getting access to those suffering within the isolated refugee camps themselves. What are the conditions of the refugees who stay in camps or settlements for protracted periods of time? Their situation can differ widely. For some, refugee camps are closed. That is, the refugees are not allowed to leave the camps and are densely concentrated. For others, they may be distributed in more open settlements and permitted to have some access to the markets and jobs of the host country. The psyche shrivels and the morale wanes faster, of course, in the former instance. The fabric of life generally in refugee camps is characterized by all sorts of pathology, despite the courage, will, and resiliency of their inhabitants. Disruption and disorientation, dependency, apathy, powerlessness, loss of self-esteem, claustrophobia, pressure on the family, deterioration of authority structures, and the random violence which follows. The longer refugees remain refugees, the more these characteristics are intensified. Moral strength is sapped, frustration sets in. Anger and hate can grow and multiply, and the potential for Palestinization, a profoundly tragic term even if the phenomenon was never repeated, increases, as perhaps in the case of the 250,000 Khmer displaced persons along the Thai border, the 400,000 Oromo and ethnic Somalis from Ethiopia who have been in Somalia since 1979, and the 2.8 million Afghans in Pakistan. So immediate, emergency, and temporary assistance is critical. We can never fail to provide it, and for as long as it takes, but it cannot become permanent. It's a wasting option, and its unrelieved, unliberated continuance is both unacceptable and probable. What happens next? Are there effective possibilities which lie between taking care of the emergency and attacking the root causes of refugee problems? This brings us to the three classical durable solutions which the international community relies on as long-run alternatives to immediate assistance in place. Repatriation, the voluntary return to the country from which the refugees fled. Local integration, establishing new homes in the countries of first asylum. And third country resettlement, transporting and transplanting refugees to a distant country where there is the opportunity to begin a new life. How dynamic, how viable, how intensive are these durable solutions? Resettlement to a third country ideally should be the last option to be considered. This is difficult for the strongest among us, extremely so for refugees who often lack the resources, education, or adaptability to a new environment. To make such a transition a success requires a tremendous effort, both on the part of the refugees and those taking them in. The process is difficult, it is expensive, and many cannot meet the restrictive eligibility requirements necessary to qualify for permanent admission to third countries. There is also the risk that resettlement itself will be seen as a route for migration, a magnet effect which attracts further refugee flows. This is not to say that resettlement does not remain a viable option for a limited few, a necessary component in the mix of solutions needed to cope with problems as we seek other solutions. It is not to say that many refugees do not make the transition successfully and flourish in their new homes. The U.S. has been the world's leader in resettling refugees from distant lands, particularly Indochina, from where over 800,000 refugees have arrived in the past 11 years, adding rich new thread to the fabric of the American tapestry. But as a solution with broad applicability, resettlement has reached a plateau and will fall off. We will continue to resettle refugees, as will other countries who have generously opened their doors to them. About 1/3 of the U.S. refugee assistance budget for FY87 of $340 million goes for resettlement of roughly 65,000 refugees in this country. But about 2/3 of that same $340 million goes for international assistance for roughly 10 million refugees in place. Resettlement can be a solution for only about 1% of the world's refugees. First asylum countries around the world are currently among the poorest in their own right and are often struggling under the burden of newly arrived populations in need of assistance. Although their response has been remarkable, in the long run they are unlikely to be able to provide significant opportunities for the second durable solution, permanent local integration of large numbers of refugees. Exceptions where hospitality has been warm and in-country integration has worked well can be found, especially in Africa, where hundreds of thousands of refugees have found new homes, in Burundi, Rwanda, Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Zaire, and Zambia. But even in Africa, things are beginning to constrict. Countries are becoming less willing, or their fragile economies less able to bear the weight of new populations. In Southeast Asia, where first asylum countries, supported by efforts of the UNHCR and the resettlement countries, have granted refugees asylum for more than a decade with no end in sight, there are accumulating pressures, and prospects for refugees settling in that region are not bright. Voluntary repatriation, the most desirable traditional durable solution, is often the most difficult to achieve. For a person to be willing to return home, the conditions which forced him or her to become a refugee in the first place must be resolved. All too frequently, the causes of refugee flight are intractable and unlikely to disappear soon. Some repatriation is taking place, and the UNHCR is taking the lead with attempts at cooperation by certain members of the international community. As a goal, we hold out the hope that more situations where repatriation is possible can be encouraged and will develop. In Africa, again, voluntary repatriation is a natural and active phenomenon. Over a dozen different repatriations there are occurring now or have recently, either spontaneously or assisted by the UNHCR and other organizations. So there are ebbs as well as flows, but they are not symmetrical, given the stubborn disruptions across major portions of the continent, and Africa is an exception in this respect to begin with. What is key to recognize is that the three classical durable solutions, while important and valuable options in managing refugee situations, are today limited and insufficient in and of themselves. If we are really serious about aiding people who have reached such a state of fear and discouragement that they are willing to abandon everything, we must not only manage refugees once they arrive in first asylum and press all three durable solutions, but also find ways to achieve conditions which allow them to stop being refugees and to prevent them from becoming refugees in the first place. Excuse me. We have come to the final and fundamental two questions. Do nation states, individually and in concert, have the imagination and the political will to address effectively the root causes of the refugee problem? Can refugee issues be reconciled with other forces and interests in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy? Wouldn't it be pretty to think so, said Jake to Lady Brett in response to her romantic projection of the future on the last page of The Sun Also Rises. We have already confronted and accommodated many juxtapositions of refugee issues and foreign policy needs in getting to this stage of our discussion, but in addressing root causes, the interrelationship, which is a complex, dynamic, inevitable, and critical one, is most tested. Foreign policy strategies affect refugee interests, and refugee realities infect foreign policy in a variety of ways. Refugees tend to be highly impactful in international relations. The decision to be a refugee is a political statement differentiating between nation states, and the decision to grant asylum, aside from humanitarian motivation, can be seen as a hostile act by a neighbor. Refugees are volatile, sometimes prone to destabilizing activity. They are vulnerable, sometimes subject to destructive exploitation. They are burdensome and intrusive in terms of economic and social progress, affecting international resource competition and allocation. They often participate in insurgencies which are international by the fact of their location on the other side of an international border and by the support they may receive from foreign sources, posing crucial foreign policy decisions for a variety of countries. The fact that they are freedom fighters does not mean that they aren't also refugees. The definitions are frequently combined or blurred, and the relatives and camp followers are even harder to type. Are they co-conspirators, hapless pawns, or innocents? And what should be done with them? External aggressive creates refugees which then have to be dealt with, as in Afghanistan and Cambodia. Refugee populations may themselves become powerful factors in regional struggles, such as the Palestinian refugees. Donor and resettlement countries have to decide what weight to give aid to refugees or to refugee-affected states, whether to try to change or prevent change in governments tied up with refugee problems, to support or oppose refugee insurgencies, to press for first asylum or repatriation at the costs of other interests. Trade policies, security needs, deficit fighting initiatives, all can be influenced or can influence refugees. So much for the interdependence. What are the root causes which our foreign policy would have to address in order that refugee phenomena be radically alleviated? It is an intimidating list, particularly if you even pause to consider what might actually be done about its entries, which essentially divide into 4 clusters, each threatening constant and widespread. 1, war and violence, a huge number of continuing armed conflicts in various areas of the world. 2, the brutal violation and abuse of human rights, systematic and particular, in most of the countries on this planet. 3, massive migrations of people within nations and across increasingly distant boundaries. And 4, the ruthless disparity of rich and poor, or more precisely, grinding poverty brought on by various natural and man-made causes, again suffered by the majority of the world's peoples. As a hypothetical exercise, calculatingly if not redemptively indulgent of refugee needs, if foreign policy could work magic, what would it affect? What if those of us seized with refugee issues could have our druthers and behave as if they were the only problems we had to worry about? What if we did not have to contend with conflicting policy interests? If foreign policy was in fact refugee policy, which of course is not so, and what other interests might be served and problems lessened in doing so? We would try to bring an end to insurgencies and military occupations, which have as their only inevitable result the deprivation of those least able to survive. We would try to terminate the traffic in arms around the world. We would greatly increase our economic development aid to remove the seeds both of economic migration and the kinds of disequilibriums that bloom into refugee-generating situations. Radical efforts would focus on aiding those countries wallowing in economic morass to build viable economies capable of providing opportunities for their people and staving off both the specter of true hunger and the hunger for a better life elsewhere. Citizens in all countries would be provided access to the political institutions which influence their destiny. If this, our Panglossian mission, were successful, fear of persecution and repression would have no place in the human condition, and true democracy, religious tolerance, and economic freedom would reign. So much for dreaming. Although the dreams do reveal the profoundness of our problems, the near daunting challenge even of how to begin to address them, the commonality of refugee and other less esoteric aspirations, and how improbable it is that it will all come about. For the advancing of refugee policy, not at the expense of, but within the pluralism of foreign policy, what is required is elevation and integration. Refugee values should play a more influential role at the higher levels of macro policy making and in the competition of forces which determine its shape. Refugees are just one facet in the multifaceted competition among legitimate interests which must be coordinated and reconciled in the molding of foreign policy. To move toward affecting those conditions so as to bring relief to the world refugee situation, refugee interests should become more, not less, political, more relevant, less isolated, if they are to influence the scale of foreign policy decision-making in their favor. Specifically, this should be achieved in deliberations with those officials responsible for regional and bilateral relationships in the State Department and with the NSC staff, in representations abroad and with multilateral agencies, in program design and budget planning across the executive branch, in intensive and continuing consultations with Congress, and finally, in public education and relations with voluntary agencies, churches, state governments, and resettlement communities. Accepting the narrow view or the narrow management of refugee interests is self-defeating in two ways. It denies reality and falsely inflates expectations, and it locks into a self-defeating parochialism where you are constantly chasing your tail and losing ground. To come back from where we started tonight, we must seek affinity and mutual benefit. This is both idealistic and sophisticated, and it better be both. The task is extremely arduous, almost futile, requiring affirmation and resoluteness, rejecting sentiment, complacency, and cynicism. First, by actively inserting refugees into the fray of competing interests before influential actors, there is a higher possibility of arriving at a policy that will be less likely to generate or exacerbate refugees. Second, if a policy is decided upon which has refugee consequences, it will be with the foreknowledge, and the responsible officials will be alert to the problems before they occur, and thus better able to deal with the results. Third, engagement with these humanitarian concerns will serve to enlighten policymakers generally at a level where critical decisions are made, presumably to the benefit of other interests as well. Thank you.
Jonathan reminds us how much we miss him, and I think that we couldn't have a better unfolding for us of a problem that a friend and colleague here is going to try to manage. Let me abuse the chair to put a first question, and then let me suggest that the microphones are open here on the first floor for questions, and guests from upstairs or others are welcome to put questions for some discussion of an issue which some of you here are sort of refugee followers. Most of us, this is a problem we think about from time to time and then put it out of our mind to get on with the business that we have otherwise to do, I suspect. And Jonathan, let me put to you a question about how this seems as a manager. I mean, as a sucker for lost causes, as I have often said to you, anybody that stayed 12 years as the director of the Institute of Politics in a school like this could be nothing else. But if I listen to the description of the problem, and I'm really interested in the management issue, how does it look and how does it feel? Okay? I look at the problem as you describe it. Why a decade hence is it not going to be twice as bad, not half as bad? And I'm doing my forecast. 10 years now, they're going to be 10 million refugees, or 20, or 5. It's going to be 20. Okay? Just if I look at your description of the fundamental factors that are moving it. So now I go to your dreams. Okay? You say utopian or Panglossian. Are those on? going to eliminate war and the causes of war? Good luck. Okay, I don't think so. Okay. So now, as I try to take it back, I mean, if one of us should have the good or bad fortune of shouldering the responsibilities you shoulder for all of us, how is it as a management problem, and as it compares to the job that you did so well here?
The job here was a lark. When I took the job of U.S. Coordinator for Refugees, which was situated directly under the President, with the idea of coordinating across the entire executive branch the various chunks of refugee programs and resources and activities in the executive branch, and also with responsibilities to do a lot of interaction with the Congress and be a principal negotiator internationally on refugee problems, I figured, hey, the only way I'm going to be able to do this job is to figure out a way to concentrate on a very few specific problems. Classical, taught here at the Kennedy, approach taught here at the Kennedy School. Some problems would be longer range problems, trying to get out ahead of the trends and the developments in the future that we see. Some of them would be attacking impacted areas of refugee problems which we may have been experiencing for a long while, but we haven't broken. So the first thing that happened to me on my way to this strategy was that I was asked, and I agreed to also take on one of these refugee chunks within the Department of State, the Bureau of Refugee Programs, to manage and to run myself. So I'm a coordinator and a coordinatee. I'm a split personality. I won't go into the reasons why that was pressed upon me and why I thought, on balance, it was a good thing to do. But out the window went my notion of selective management of carefully chosen problems. And indeed, one of the reasons that I agreed to do this, there were two reasons why I agreed to do this. One was that the coordinator doesn't have any power. Anybody who's called coordinator, let alone with a capital C, is sort of convicting himself of being a horse's ass in public, in that any hard-driving, tough, resilient bureaucrat will never let anybody called a coordinator coordinate him or her. And in the Refugee of 1980, which somewhat embarrassingly created this job and this job description, there is a lot of rhetoric, but there are no resources. There is no power. You got to live by your wits. You got to do a lot of persuasion. You may have to do some cheating and some sidling, and hope for the best. I felt that in that situation, it might be important to get some resources, to get a budget, to get some cavalry known, may God forgive me and protect them, as the Bureau for Refugee Programs in the Department of State. The other thing which made me make this decision was my realization that refugee politics are about as vicious as they get. And a lot of people who are competent and skilled and dedicated and resourceful, who are in the refugee advocacy and the refugee servicing area, think about with great intensity their own piece of the action, not the worldwide problem, integrated or chaotic as it may be. Therefore, if the U.S. Coordinator for Refugees, this big highfalutin poobah, who's supposed to work magic around the world and in the United States in refugee areas, is not covering every single base, when the political flak hits, you're dead before you start. I can go on about managing this for a lot longer than even Graham wants me to. So I'll sum up by saying, in an adequate answer to his problem, although I hope I've provided some insight into my management approach to it by the stories that I've just told you. Of course it's lighting candles for St. Jude. I've said repeatedly that it's near futile, it's almost hopeless in my own remarks. Of course you can't ban war, but if war is the reason you get refugees, and if your job is to try and do something for them, and if you think that philosophically and spiritually it will benefit your country if you do a good job, and if you get your country to do a good job in that respect, then you sure as hell got to try.
The microphones are open, and let me turn to Don Price, the former dean of the school. Don?
Dean Allison, the thing that troubles me most about the pitfall into which our old friend has dropped is this. A refugee program is not something which one major power can do without reference to its competitors, its rivals, or its enemies. And as I think about this problem, what bothers me the most is that we are dealing as a country ourselves that is multi-ethnic, and is a country which has great degree of freedom for competing political ideas and doctrines. We are dealing with the product of these rivalries on the international scene, and we must be facing the troubles and the enmity of the major powers who have produced many of the refugees by their fights and their rivalries throughout the world. And I know this must have been, Jonathan, on your mind, but I wonder how you see that picture in the long run.
Thank you, Don. Well, I see it very bleakly. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that this is a very pluralistic problem, very conflicted, and despite a lot of breastbeating, the United States must be very careful to recognize its limitations in dealing with the problem. I mentioned that we are a donor state and a resettlement state. I might point out, incidentally, just parenthetically, that there are in the world nation states which contribute very substantial, very sincere humanitarian assistance to refugees, who also simultaneously pursue policies which have as a byproduct the generation of refugees. This is part of the problem that Don is alluding to. We, outside of the money that we provide to multilateral organizations, which proportionally is a lot, much more than anybody else, but on a per capita basis less than some other countries are providing. Outside of the fact that we resettle vastly more refugees than anybody else in the world, but remember that 1% of the total refugee population I mentioned. Outside of the fact that through negotiation, jawboning, marginal pressures, leverage, we must remember that we can't do very much. The people who are generating the refugees and who are receiving the refugees are the people who are the most affected. Nevertheless, we are a major actor internationally. We get involved in a lot of issues. We are looked for a lot of leadership and help, usually not the kind of leadership, or often not the kind of leadership which we're prepared to give, leadership being a very subjective term. And we can, over time, in the aggregate, and in specific instances, in immediate terms, be of some influence. What I'm trying to tell you is that both what Graham has said and what you've said, Don, underscore in different ways the difficulty of the problem. And if I were to make outright predictions, I was making some implicit comments about the future in my speech. I think I'd have to pack up and go home. But if our advocacy can be elevated and integrated in the United States government and internationally, we may be able to find some openings and we may be able to make some breaks. But one country, the United States, and one refugee coordinator in a line of dedicated and unsuccessful refugee coordinators has got a great deal ahead of them. I'm asked by people if I enjoy my job, and it sort of gives me a little bit of a problem, that word, and it makes me admit to too much of a combination of Calvinism and masochism if I say yes. So when Ken Hartnett asked me if I enjoyed my job, and I sort of fussed around with the meaning of that word, he said, "I don't mean enjoyment, I mean, is it intense?" It is intense. The only way I know how to answer your question, other than analytically and in terms of operational strategies, is that you've got to up the intensity.
Don?
May I add just one word? I think the combination of Calvinism and masochism is the one combination that lets people face problems in the modern world. Congratulations.
Let me go here to the gentleman on the left, and then let me impose on Ira Jackson, a former assistant director of the Institute and associate dean here, to see whether he judges this problem to be more impossible than his problems. But here on the left.
Ambassador Moore, my question regards root causes, specifically one. Some analysts have attributed the famine in Ethiopia, for instance, to, or characterized that famine as the inevitable result of communist economic policies, or perhaps the deliberate creation of the communist authorities there. And the connection between communism and refugee problems is more clear in Afghanistan, where violence plays a more direct role. And my question is simply this: what percentage or what portion of those 10 million refugees in the world do you believe are attributable to either communist aggression or to communist economic policy? And perhaps it might be helpful to break down communist economic policy into two parts: that which is deliberate use of economic methods that create famine, as opposed to those that are simply beyond individual control, once having accepted the use of communist policy to start with. Thank you.
Well, if halfway through your question I had an answer, but I just ran out. Communism in one form or another is obviously responsible for generating a lot of refugees. An estimate of this, unadorned by documentation, which I therefore left out of my speech, was that nevertheless about half the world's refugee population do not come from communist regimes or from communism or from some combination of the aggression and the economic policies. I don't know how that. First of all, that isn't a very helpful statistic, 50-50, and it doesn't break it down the way you want me to. The second part of your question, though, I mean, the second part of your point, the economic policy point, in addition to the aggression point, right? It's not just economic policy. It's a combination of various kinds of domestic policies, including economic policy, but also including a whole ideology and a whole system of government which can produce refugees even apart from what happens economically. So I'm skinning out of the second part of your question, but I'd like to make an observation that most problems stem from a whole bunch of different causes, and I tend to resist my own temptation to be too simplistic or to try to pin down quantitative measurements too much in this field. It's very hard to get any kind of facts that you can rely on, even from your own people, partly because sometimes the issues are so controversial that the truth or facts as they are perceived do not want to be conveyed, partly because sometimes people think they understand what's going on, they don't, and partly because they just plain are trying to handle the problems as they come to them, and they don't have enough knowledge to really analyze them. But take Mozambique, for instance. There has been an element or an influence of Marxism in that country, largely ebbed, I think. And now there's an insurgency war. There has been an insurgency war going on now. It's gotten worse in recent months or recent years, which is largely responsible for generating the refugees. But they have had drought and famine and flood, and famine and flood and famine and famine in Mozambique. And it's when these, maybe you could say three things: the inefficient or the repressive policies of the government, natural disasters, and insurgency wars, but at least the second two. That's where the cruelty, the suffering, the waste is at its greatest. So I mean, I think it's important to understand what role the communist ideology and the fact of communist governments and communist policies play. And I don't want in any way to underestimate that. If you can take credit for half of this 10 million people, you're doing pretty good. But I don't want to oversimplify it, and I don't want to indicate that if that weren't so, we wouldn't have enormous refugee problems in the world, because we would, which are not attributable to those causes.
Ira, what would you say about this?
Well, I'm mortified that you've called upon me, Graham, because I think it trivializes any analogy between any of those of us who are attempting to manage in the public sector even tough issues like drug abuse, tax enforcement, alcoholism. And I were reduced to having to go to the board, I would suggest that the elements in common would include at least the degree to which Jonathan has probably brought or restored a strategic conception of the role. Complicated, diffuse, but now articulate. And that's so rare and missing so many times in public life. The degree to which I bet, in fact I'm sure, Jonathan's moral conviction, as well as his tenacity, provides a cheerleader for an organization in need of uplift. That's a common denominator, it seems to me, that any good manager aspires to bring. The notion that he's instilled accountability for that very little that he can deliver, and that this country can offer to the solution of these intractable global issues, I think is important and sorely missing from most of government. The fact that Jonathan is not just the coordinator, but also the manager and the person who wants to be held accountable for results over the limited domain that he has some say over. And finally, and I think most importantly in this issue, and in so many others, again without trivializing or comparing my own responsibilities to him, the notion that he sees as fundamental and perhaps most important, the role he's playing tonight, which is to educate and to, in effect, in some small, seemingly insignificant way, change behavior in the marketplace that makes these problems we're called upon to manage so intractable in the long run.
Edith Wilkie wants to follow it before you answer. So
okay, but I do want to make a comment on Ira's.
Edith wants to follow it.
I defer to you, John.
No, but should we get rid of what I want to say to Ira first? Two comments. First of all, my two colleagues and old friends, no one would pursue such public mortification more than Graham, and no one would transcend it or even take it on more than Ira. The second comment is, there's one difference, Ira, putting aside trivia or trivializing. Your job is close enough to being able to be achieved so that you really are on the line. You really are accountable. Mine is so fuzzy and so distant that nobody ever blamed me, and I'll just kind of drift away after a while.
Never, never. You're much too substantial, Jonathan.
Edith Stokey, the Secretary of the Faculty. Go ahead.
Ira spoke of how helpful you've been in educating us, and I need to be educated a little further. You've talked a lot about refugees, and you've mentioned in passing displaced persons. The distinction has perhaps not been in the forefront of all of our minds, but it's now a useful one. I'm curious about the people who are the refugees and what you can tell us about them. Specifically, what do you find in the way of age distribution, gender distribution? What do the patterns look like over history? Do you find systematic differences across countries? And what are the implications, if any, of these differences, if you find them, for these durable solutions that you suggest, such as repatriation, integration, and resettlement?
How one is tested by one's friends. Again, I can give you the first, make a comment on the first part of your question, and won't do as well on the second. As you and I were talking before dinner, Edith, you pointed out that the incidence of women and children in refugee camps and among refugees is extraordinarily high. And there are noble but puny efforts so far to do much about that, including the beginning or the marginal continuation, I'm not sure which, of programs for women in really basically developmental programs and assistance programs for women who are refugees to identify, understand, and address their particular problems. When you're so much in the margin in this business, you're just getting the food out and you're getting the shelter out, and you're trying to figure out, is there any kind of an educational system which might even be started here, just for primary school students? And what are the most dangerous health challenges that you try to get a hold of? And then, you know, you got your head on the ground by that time. But there is a recognition. I can't give you the demographic breakdown by countries or by ethnic groups, but partly because of the insurgency relationship to refugees, there's a lot of older people and a lot of women and children in these camps. Also, there are special programs, other than educational programs, which are being attempted, which address children. They tend to be more in the area of resettlement, which is such a small proportion. To get back to what you said at the beginning about displaced persons versus refugees, the question of definitions and labels and categories and identities of refugees and who's a refugee and who isn't gets very complex. Let me just say three things about that, because I take it was the beginning of your question. Refugee, first of all, is a term that's used generally and sort of commonsensibly to describe people that are outside of their own country and in some kind of trouble. The international and legal definitions tend to be quite restrictive in breaking down. They're restrictive and they're prescriptive rather than they are being descriptive. For instance, the Cambodians along the border in Thailand are displaced persons, and the Afghans who are on the Pakistan side of the Afghan-Pak border are called refugees. And their situation is almost identical as far as I can figure out. So if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it ain't a duck, it's a displaced person. And this means that there are a lot of politics and self-interest being played in refugee definitions and categories. There are also sometimes redemptive politics played, so that the definitions are euchred the other way, so you can give help to people who wouldn't otherwise get it. The classical international definition of a refugee is someone who has been persecuted or faces a well-founded fear of persecution if they were to return to their own country, which they are now out of. And that is the definition which is used when we try to sort out which refugees who want to come and be resettled in the United States are eligible and qualify for that settlement. There are other, thankfully, definitions, including the definition of the Organization of African Unity, which expands that definition to basically include people who may not have been persecuted, but who have fled civil violence, domestic turmoil in their own country. The classical definition leaves out the following categories. It leaves out people who are fleeing war, fleeing violence, as the OAU definition does not. It leaves out economic migrants, which is very, very difficult, but one of the easier distinctions to make. It leaves out people who are fleeing drought and natural disasters, famine. It even leaves out people from, although there's lots of exceptions to this, it leaves out people from communist countries who have not been individually persecuted but merely feel oppressed and have their freedoms restricted by the overall governmental system. The definition which is accepted in the main statute in the United States, which gives us money to contribute to international refugee assistance efforts in this multilateral system international system that I was describing, is a very broad definition. So that in order to give assistance, you don't have to try to figure out whether someone's been persecuted or not when they come across the border and they're in trouble. That is very fortunate. So, and there are lots of, different countries handle this definition problem differently. So if you look across the world and how people are dealing with legal definitions, everybody isn't like the United States. There are long-term legislative changes in definitions which could be made, and there could be a category, for instance, of humanitarian definition, which would give us more opportunity than we have in the United States now to deal with people who are not immigrants, and who are not refugees, but who are people who are in some dire need in between. The influx, the phenomena of increased illegal immigration, which is occurring worldwide, but particularly in the Western, northern, industrialized world from the third world, is becoming sufficiently intense. One current example of it is that a lot of people from Central America who are in this country and who will not qualify for amnesty under the new immigration legislation are going to Canada. And the Canadians are coming under such pressure that they don't feel, in terms of either their political support that they can sustain in Canada, or in terms of their budgets, that they can both deal with a progressive refugee policy and a refugee admissions policy, which is very generous, very progressive in Canada, and a reasonably open immigration policy at the same time. And I've mentioned earlier the relatively new phenomenon, at least at the levels that we're experiencing it, of third world peoples coming through Europe claiming asylum, which are regarded as illegal immigrants until they qualify for asylum, which they may not do. And there's a lot of restricting and constricting going on in Europe now. So in terms of definitions and who these people are, the category of illegal immigrants is now encroaching upon and infecting, in a sense, the category of refugees, defined in a variety of ways.
I think we have 6 minutes left before our witching hour, and I want to go first to this lady, then Phil Hyman, who, another one of Jonathan's colleagues, has an unhelpful comment, and then to this lady, and we stop. Okay? So we start here.
Ambassador Moore, you talk a lot about addressing the root causes of what generates refugees, and you express a sort of almost helplessness in saying that there are some causes that even we as the United States can't do too much about. But one thing I did not hear you or anybody mention is that it may be that some of the United States policies, especially the foreign policies in supporting repressive regimes in Central America, such as El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, under the Duvaliers, creates a wave of Central American refugees. Now, you were talking about integrating refugee policy in with foreign policy. Do you think it's possible to address these concerns within the administration, or is it more effective to be in a movement like the sanctuary movement, in a sort of a popular movement within the United States to try and change U.S. foreign policy, which may be generating refugees?
Thank you. It's clearly a very valid question. I meant, however, to address it at various times in my speech, although if you said, well, you kind of weasel-worded it, Mr. Ambassador, you really weren't very explicit about it, you would be correct. I was more implicit than explicit. I do feel that by the very dynamic of elevating and integrating refugee considerations into broader foreign policy formulating, and which involves decisions about the questions that you're raising, about the policies you're raising, is a way that must be pursued to get at it. Whether they will be successful or not, I don't know. And in any given instance, whether the legitimate competing policy interests which in a given instance may vie against refugee interests, which is higher or more important, I don't know. It isn't automatically one way or the other. We have to examine that on a case-by-case basis. As I've said, I think that refugees are generated by insurgency wars and by a lot of other things. And as I've said, nations sometimes pursue policies which have the byproduct of negative consequences for refugees. How that's sorted out is by the dynamic which I've suggested to you. I don't have a better idea than that. Now, with regard to your second point, you raised a point about roles. Is it better to do it within the government, or is it better to do it through movements like the sanctuary movement outside the government? I am not here tonight to endorse the sanctuary movement or other movements that I might not know the full force of outside of the government, intending to put pressure on the government. My job is to do what I can do within the government, and to do that as best as I know how. We're living in a pluralistic, thankfully, we're living in a pluralistic society, and A, and B, I've already described the international refugee effort as being very pluralistic, with a lot of people necessarily playing a lot of different roles.
Phil Hyman, professor here and from the law school. Phil, would you use the microphone, and then we come to this lady for the final question. Phil.
Hi, Jonathan. Jonathan, what do you make of the fact that, everybody's been treating the refugee problem pursuant to your invitation?
Try not to do a number on me, Phil, okay?
I'm afraid it's too late. Everybody's been treating it as an insoluble problem. But probably for $1,000 a refugee, the refugees would be welcome in the country of first asylum, $1,000 a year per refugee. And if that were so, you're talking about 10 million refugees times $1,000 is $10 billion, spread across a Western economy of probably $10 trillion. I don't know what the figure is. You're not talking about an immense amount of money. Now, this is a serious question. What do you make of the fact that somehow or other we don't imagine solutions that would cost $1,000 a refugee a year? I mean, I assume that there wouldn't be a refugee problem if we gave every refugee $1,000 a year. And yet that isn't an imaginable solution. What do you make of that? And that's a serious question. I'm sorry, it's also a screwball, but it's a serious
Well, maybe I make a number of things of it. One is that, just by way of, just in passing, the biggest problem that I've faced in my own job since I've been in it, as limited as that job is resources. It's basically, or it's the biggest strain, or the biggest pressure, the biggest, not that I can't correct, is getting more resources. And one of the points that I mentioned as being an illustration of a competitive, legitimate policy interest that in this case was vying against what you might call more parochially refugee interests, is the deficit fighting strategy of both the Congress and the federal executive. I can't get, or the refugee programs can't get, the monies that we were getting 2 or 3 years ago, which were inadequate. And you're talking about huge multiples of that. Next, I would say that if you gave each refugee in the world $1,000 a year, it wouldn't solve the refugee problem. And I think that the analysis or the tour that I tried to provide will demonstrate, will reveal that. Money, resources, funds we can do a great deal with, but not enough and not everything. We've got to change the behavior of nation states. And that's the final comment, which we've come back to repeatedly. And I didn't say hopeless, I said nearly hopeless. You could try to buy off wars. One way of looking at that is the foreign aid program and the priority which this pluralistic democracy, thinking of various competing needs for funds, including management of your national economy, back to the deficit question, We have not felt it was in our national priority to provide levels of support to international financial institutions and levels of support to development aid that wasn't directly connected to military aid as not just a matter of administration. This has been going either plateaued or going downhill since 1960. But before that, that's just happened when it's just the first time I happened to become conscious of it or involved in it. And again, if we got those levels substantially up, we wouldn't be close to what you're talking about. But that is an example of how you would apply funds to try to get at root causes which generate both wars and refugees.
Final question here.
Thank you. We are not at the Divinity School, but I'm struck, Ambassador Moore, by the use of theological language tonight. Redemptive, you've used several times. Calvinism, masochism, maybe an implied martyrdom. Lighting a candle for St. Jude. And it sounds to me as though, in a sense, you're calling also for a kind of moral leadership among nation states. Given our own role in Southeast Asia as one of those generating forces for the present situation, is it not time now, 12 years later, for some reconciliation to begin to happen in this country around the issue of Southeast Asian refugees, displaced people, reopening negotiations with Vietnam? 12 years later, the scars are very deep, and yet do you see it as a possibility in your role, particularly in light of the recent legislation filed by Senator Hatfield and Congressman Atkins to take a look at that Southeast Asian refugee processing, where the discussion might begin to be opened or addressed about reconciliation, at least in that part of the world where we had a significant role?
Thank you. The legislation which is proposed by, or the amendments proposed by Congressman Atkins and the legislation proposed by Senator Hatfield, as worthy initiatives as they may represent, would not in fact get at the problem you're talking about. I always think there's a greater possibility of reconciliation than we seem to be able to, and we, I mean, I'm talking about the world, not just the United States, or not just we in this room, and we seem to be able to pull off. If you're talking about being more persistent in pursuing that kind of reconciliation in our relations with the communist states in Southeast Asia, yes, I think that we should be more resourceful and more imaginative. But this is one of the problems that I was commenting on with regard to Phil's question. There are stubborn commitments, cultural characteristics, ideological obstacles which the Vietnamese are clinging to that do not lend themselves easily to reconciliation. And as much as I am committed to the notion of not making excuses and figuring out ways to break through intractable problems, there are a lot of other countries which, with different policies towards Vietnam than we have, who have been unable to change the patterns and to break through. The principal cause, I'm moved to say the exclusive cause, of the refugee problem in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. We have a special relationship to that problem because of our involvement in that part of the world. But in a different way, we tried to change them and we failed. You were saying, well, can't we try something different? We may be able to, we might be able to. But it is very rigid and is very difficult. And to take upon ourselves the responsibility for changing, for eradicating root causes, almost to the extent that we are responsible for the root causes, can in itself be counterproductive. I am anguished by your question. If that's another word used at the divinity school, then so be it.
The unflinching insistence of hopelessness and hopefulness that Jonathan has communicated so effectively tonight is the essence, at least as I think of it, of our good friend Jonathan. When we go home tonight and try to answer the question, what did we do to justify our existence today? How many of us will be able to say that we improved the life prospects of tens of people, or hundreds, or thousands, and that the problem for which we were responsible got worse? So for Jonathan's remarks, as a local dean, I remember how much we miss him, and as an American and a citizen, I count ourselves fortunate to have him in this current job. So we're glad that he's there, and we'll look for him coming back.